Welcome to Ancient Awakening with Castalia. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Castalia and I work on the realm of inspiration at elfianrealm.com to help inspire the collective on their ascension journey. I work to help heal and guide through my channeled readings and coaching sessions. I am a certified card reader, channeler, and crystal Reiki master, as well as well-versed and certified in Greek mythology and ancient Greek gods and goddesses. So what better way to combine both of my passions than to uncover the spiritual metaphors hidden in the myths? The teachings and guidelines already are there before us. They're just hidden beneath the surface of stories full of tragedy, heartbreak, war, death, love, and more. The time for metaphors is done, so let's find clarity together through a transformative journey that is Ancient Awakening. And on this cozy, chill fall day, it is time to dive into episode 9 of Ancient Awakening. In every soul, there is a tension between the part that seeks truth and the part that resists it. The lower self is not the ego, it is deeper, older, and more cunning. It is the part of us that fears transformation, clings to control, and hides from the divine. In Greek myth, this shadow is not abstract. It walks in kings and lovers, tyrants and priests. It builds labyrinths, plots in silence, and mocks the gods. In this episode, we descend into the myths of Minos, Pentheus, and Aegisthus, three figures who followed the lower self and paid the price dearly. Their stories are not just warnings, they are mirrors. Because the lower self does not live in monsters. It lives within us. And the choices we make when we are afraid to become something more, something higher, something more on the path of enlightenment. So let this be a ritual of recognition. Let's let today be that. A descent into the shadow to remember that the higher self is not found by avoiding the lower self, but by facing it and choosing differently. However, before we fully dive into this week's episode, let's recap the journal prompts from last week, and I'm going to give a short summary of my response to these prompts. And as always, these prompts are found on the community page in the description, and you are more than welcome to re-answer them in the comments below. Now, the first prompt was, what does free will mean to me, and where in my life do I feel most empowered to choose? Free will to me means the ability to choose a path that is in alignment with your authenticity, that you choose it without judgment, and you choose it because it resonates with you. Free will should resonate with you on a deeper level. Choices that you are making that are truly your own and that are not influenced by society or programming or anything else. It is something that truly comes from your soul, from your heart of hearts. This is something that I was always taught as a child. My mom said, if it is in your heart of hearts and you know in your heart of hearts that it's true, you follow it. And that has guided me my entire life. And that to me is what free will is. And it also, free will means respecting other people's choices when they choose something that resonates with them, and honoring and respecting your own and not feeling guilty for the choices you make, unless you make poor choices, of course. Then forgive yourself, let go of that guilt and move on, but to not feel guilty for choosing your authenticity. And I feel most empowered to choose when it comes to my path, when it comes to what I am doing with my life, to choose the things that resonate with me. But even in a more like simple way, I feel most empowered to choose when I say yes to opportunities and experiences, but also when I acknowledge when something doesn't resonate with me and I say no. So it's when I am given a choice of an opportunity and experience and knowing what resonates with me. And I'm at a point in my life where, and in the spiritual journey, where to choose something that resonates with your authenticity is to choose something that is going to bring you joy. So I've switched from just like doing anything and everything to try and like make some sort of progress to just following what resonates true with me, which is the goal, of course. So the next one from last week was, have I ever opened a metaphorical Pandora's box? What did I learn from the consequences of that choice? I opened a metaphorical Pandora's box. I'm going to talk about this very briefly because I really don't want to dive too deep into it, even more briefly than how I summarize my prompts otherwise. But it was when I decided that I wanted to uncover more about my estranged father's family and actually understand them, like understand the experiences, understand their mentality, understand everything. So I opened a Pandora's box of uncovering everything that actually made what had happened to me 10 times worse when I uncovered the backstory. And the consequence was, it wasn't a consequence, actually it was easier for me to forgive and let go, but now it's like being burdened with that knowledge and knowing those things, and now I guess the consequence is I am more acutely aware of my actions and behaviors, like more aware of it and more aware of not repeating those patterns. I did that to break ancestral cycles, so I wanted to uncover everything I could possibly uncover. So I uncovered a lot about myself in this physical incarnation and also a lot about what I don't want to be. So not necessarily a consequence, but that's the biggest Pandora's box experience I had. Third from last week was, when have I used my free will to serve something greater like Prometheus, and what did it cost me? I really struggled with this prompt, but I think one thing that I used my free will for that was like for something greater was when I chose to do like volunteering and conservation work, specifically with marine life and sea turtles. And it cost me like money, but it wasn't like a dramatic cost. What it was that my life changed. It resulted in me changing my life, and for the better. It was a positive thing. What it cost me was the old version of myself. I completely became a different person after working on sea turtle nesting beaches, and I completely changed the way that I perceived life, and I evolved and I improved in a better sense. And now I still do that, and I still do that work, and yeah, it's time consuming, but it sings to my soul, and like I would volunteer forever. I don't like need that like it to be like my job. It's something that resonates with me, and so that would be my something greater, is like helping with the conservation work. And what it cost me is some people not understanding things. I guess when people in your life would rather live in an ignorance is bliss mentality, it can kind of cost you relationships, and that would be the thing that it cost me. Or like knowing that I can't have with some like family members or friends those deeper conversations now that I understand things more, and I understand the negative impact humanity has had on the environment by being selfish. Some people don't want to listen to that. Some people don't want to listen to the fact of animal welfare and that animals experience mental and emotional pain and traumas in the same way people do. I have some relatives that don't want to accept that. So what it costs me is, while I keep doing that work to raise awareness, I learn who in my life is in alignment with those beliefs, and who is like-minded and who is not, and who is just going to be more of like a background character in my life as opposed to someone that I connect with on a deeper level. And I think sometimes when you use your free will to do something good, what it can cost you is relationships, because some people would rather live in ignorance as bliss, and it's not a good place to be. So number 4 from last week, have I ever denied someone else's agency, even subtly? What did that teach me about control and fear? I think I did as a child. I don't think I've done it more recently. I think I've been more hyper aware of my actions, but I can think of like a specific time as a child where I was like super bossy, and I wanted like control of like everything that we were doing when it came to like just like playing make-believe, playing house, those things that you do as kids. And it kind of resulted in me not being able to have as much freedom and fun, because it was like with my cousins on my estranged family side growing up, and I was a little bit too much, and so sometimes I was, because of the adults, prevented from being as free. So what I learned was just to let things be, and I was still prevented from being as free after that point, and I learned that it was not me being bossy, it was just them. But also in general, what I learned is you cannot force anyone or anything to be what you want. Everyone has free will, but that's like the only example that I could think of, and it's from childhood, where you're still comprehending what free will and choice is. And when you start your spiritual journey, you are also in that like childlike, ignorant state when it comes to a lot of things, and you are figuring things out. And so, are you at fault for the mistakes you make in the beginning when you didn't know, you didn't have the knowledge or resources to understand what you were doing? Is a question I ask you. But if you are further enough in your journey where you are very aware of the choices that you're making, that's when it comes like, are you following the lower self or the higher self, to kind of tie it into what we will be talking about this week. And when you're a child, you're not really following the lower self, you're just trying to figure out what's going on. So maybe a little bit. But as you get older and you're acutely aware of your behavior, the actions that you take, you're given two paths, either you choose the higher self or the lower self. Or that middle ground of the egoic mind. And, today's episode is going to be talking about that lower self consequences, of course. In general, when you try to prevent free will in any sense, karma will come back to you. What I learned is example as a kid trying to control what game we were playing, of course. That was just how I was. Then I had my free will taken away from me, because then I wasn't allowed to play with those kids. I wasn't allowed to do the things that I wanted to do, because I tried to take free will in a different sense, but in like a kid bossy way, not in anything super dramatic. But it happens. It's cause and effect. Really, karma is cause and effect. So karma is very real because cause and effect is real. So just wanted to put that out there. So next, the final prompt from last week is, where am I currently ignoring or suppressing my own free will, and what would it take to reclaim it? I could not think of a current example of this. An example I did think of this was when I was in high school. I was really just following, I got the teacher's pet award, okay? I would say freshman year of high school, I got the director's dream speech award, because I was very good at following instructions. I really switched from being in charge as a kid to just following orders. And I was good at adapting. When I made a mistake, I would fix it. It's not a bad thing. But when I think about that, it's a very people-pleasing thing. It's just fixing things, even if it's not the way that I would want to do it. It's it's the way that other people want it, and I want them to like me, or I want to do well. So in the past, I experienced that. And what it took was me acknowledging what I liked, and I ended up in the following years changing to doing what I liked in a way that spoke to my soul, and eventually I ended up leaving the theater arts and those things, and finding my own path in writing and creating and healing and stuff like this. But what it takes to reclaim it is acknowledging, is what I'm doing for me, or am I doing it for other people? And if I'm only doing it for other people, then is it in alignment with my authenticity? And most of the time, it's not. So then, is that honoring my free will? That's what you gotta think about. The thing with free will is that there's the positive and negatives of it, of course. We talked about this. So now, that was more last week. Now we're talking about more the negative sides of it. We're talking about following the lower self. We're gonna be talking about King Minos first. King Minos of the Minoans. And repression and the birth of the shadow. So the mythical narratives of the myth of King Minos that we are going to apply to the lower self in myth is Minos was one of the sons of Zeus and Europa and was chosen to rule Crete. To prove his divine right, he prayed to Poseidon for a sign. The sea god sent him a magnificent white bull from the waves, a creature so pure and majestic. It was clearly divine. Minos was meant to sacrifice it in gratitude, but he didn't. He admired the bull's beauty, its power, and perhaps saw it as a reflection of his own ego. He chose to keep it, substituting a lesser animal for the ritual. Poseidon, enraged by this act of defiance, cursed Minos in a way that exposed his deepest shadow. His wife, Pasiphae, was struck with unnatural desire for the bull. She begged Daedalus, the master craftsman, to build a hollow wooden cow so she could consummate her obsession. From this union came the Minotaur, a creature half man, half bull, born of lust, denial, and broken divine law. Minos, ashamed, ordered Daedalus to construct a labyrinth beneath the palace to hide the beast. He fed it human sacrifices, a cycle of repression and violence that continued until Theseus arrived to slay the Minotaur. So we did kind of talk about this a little bit in the previous episode when we talked about Ariadne and the slaying of the Minotaur. So that's like more of a backstory of that. It's a related myth. The lower self analysis is Minos' lower self is a spiritual pride and repression. He refuses to honor divine instruction, choosing control over surrender. His denial births a literal monster, a shadow made flesh. The labyrinth becomes a metaphor for the inner maze of avoidance, where the consequences of unacknowledgeable truth grow in darkness. The lower self does not just hide the shadow. It feeds it. See, Minos, his lower self, the consequence is also his wife's lower self. So his wife following that lower self of lust, and him following the lower self of thinking that he is above the divine and like, I want to keep this thing, even though I was told I needed to let it go just because it's pretty. And the consequences were then his wife creating a monster that became a physical manifestation of both of their lower selves. The Minotaur is the lower self of both Minos and his wife. It is a combination of both of their lust for pride, for desire, for lower self behaviors that result in chaos and consequences of violence and destruction. And it takes the daughter of Minos to correct the actions of her parents, to correct the actions of Minos, and the consequences of that to change the story. So yet another reason why Ariadne should be celebrated more. We talked about this in last week's episode, but like she did a lot. Without her, Theseus wouldn't have slayed the Minotaur, and also she broke the cycles of her parents by basically slaying their lower self and behaving from a more higher self perspective. So the second myth I want to talk about for this week's episode is Pentheus and the suppression of the wild and divine feminine. So Pentheus was a grandson of Cadmus and king of Thebes, ruled with order and logic. When Dionysius arrived, bringing ecstatic rites, trance, and feminine frenzy, Pentheus was appalled. The Bacchae, women possessed by divine madness, danced in the mountains, shedding societal roles and embracing wildness. Pentheus saw this as chaos, a threat to masculine control and civic order. He banned the rites, mocked Dionysius, and refused to acknowledge his own divinity and the divinity of Dionysius. Calm and cunning, Dionysius offered Pentheus a chance to see the Bacchae for himself. He disguised the king as a woman and led him to the mountains. There, in trance, Pentheus' own mother, Agave, mistook him for a wild animal and tore him apart with her bare hands, a brutal act of divine justice. Pentheus' lower self is rigid control and fear of surrender to the divine. He cannot tolerate mystery, ecstasy, or feminine power, the divine feminine power being symbolic of spirituality. His refusal to yield leads to violent fragmentation, a literal tearing apart of the self. He becomes the very thing he feared, wild, vulnerable, and consumed. The lower self fears what it cannot dominate and is destroyed by what it denies. See, if we think of this act of him being torn apart as the act of the lower self being dismantled, he wanted to control. So the lower self tries to take away free will. So I think it's like so fitting that that's the cup, that the episode I drew from the cup, from the free will episode, for this to be the next one, because it is very much related. And he wanted to, you know, ban the free will that other people were expressing. Dionysius, who was, you know, divine of a higher level than Pentheus, Pentheus thought himself better than that. When we are following the lower self, we think ourselves better than the divine, and we think we know what's best, and that's when it becomes like more egoic mindsets. And when the lower self is in control, we end up putting ourselves in situations where we are challenged with whether or not we are going to keep following this lower mentality or ascend to something greater. See, it wasn't Dionysius's plan for Pentheus to get torn apart. It was Pentheus's own story, his own experience. See, Pentheus was already hesitant to follow in to see the Bacchae. Now, Dionysius was cunning, of course, but it was not his intention that Pentheus would get torn apart. His intention was that Pentheus would see the error of his ways. He ended up seeing the errors of his ways when he was torn apart by his own mother, and his lower self was ripped apart. And you would assume that maybe then he goes down to the underworld and he sees the errors of his ways, and then in the next lifetime he can do better. Of course, yes, lower self fears, but it cannot dominate, and it's destroyed by what it denies. It's destroyed by spirituality, the divine feminine. The feminine energy in myth is symbolic of spirituality, intuition, high priestess energy, the divine femininity. In myth, we see a balance of, you know, the divine masculinity, but also toxic masculinity. And so he's in his toxic masculine, so he's not able to create from his divine masculine. And when he's in his toxic masculine, he sees only the toxic feminine and cannot look past and see the divine feminine, which means he cannot allow himself to fully embrace different aspects of spirituality, which is where he tried to use fear to control those around him. And the big lesson from that is you just gotta let people be. And if you feel like you want to control someone's choices, reflect and see what does their choices, why does that affect you? What nerve is that hitting in you? That has to do with what's going on in you, not them. So Pentheus needed to dig into himself and figure out why he wasn't okay with this. It had nothing to do with the Bacchae. It had everything to do with what was going on inside of him. And since he wasn't able to look within himself, he was torn apart. So the third and final myth is Aegisthus and manipulation and the lust for power. So Aegisthus was born of a curse. His father, Pentheus, unknowingly slept with his own daughter, a union orchestrated by a tourist to punish Aegisthus, him. Aegisthus grew up in a lineage of betrayal, vengeance, and blood. As an adult, he seduced Clytemnestra, wife of Agamemnon, while the king was away fighting in Troy. Together they plotted Agamemnon's murder, which they carried out upon his return, killing him in his bath. Aegisthus became co-ruler of Mycenae, but his reign was short-lived. Agamemnon's son, Orestes, returned and killed both Aegisthus and Clytemnestra, fulfilling the cycle of vengeance. So this is the lower self's generational cycles. You can have generational cycles that are more in the higher self, generational cycles that are more that middle ground, and generational cycles of the lower self. He had a generational cycle of the lower self. He could have, even though he was born of betrayal, even though the circumstances of his birth were not ideal, even though it was more of a vengeful act that resulted in him existing, he could have changed the story and used his free will to choose the higher ground, but he followed the lower self. And since he repeated the cycle was repeated onto him. So when you follow the lower self, those actions that you take, they find you. What you put out into the universe, it comes back to you. You have the choice to change the story so something new finds you and those after you. The lower self avoids the sword, but cannot escape the blade. Aegisthus' lower self is a cowardice masked as cunning. He avoids direct confrontation, choosing seduction and betrayal. His hunger for power is rooted in fear, and it invites in karmic justice. He's not a warrior, not a leader, but a whisper in the shadows. See, he could have chosen a different path in his life. See, he fully repeated the generational cycle. Fully repeated it. He could have chosen something different, but when he uncovered the truth, instead of learning to love and accept himself as he was despite the circumstances of why he was born, he chose to repeat those cycles because he was angry, because he was struggling to accept a part of himself. The lower self causes you to not accept all of who you are, so that you are constantly living in discourse, because if you're living in discourse, you are feeding the lower polarity. So the way to overcome that is to accept all of who you are, that you cannot control how you came to be, but you can control whether or not you accept who you are and learn to love and honor yourself and choose a different story. So the archetypal framing of these three myths is Minos is the repressor of the lower self. He hides the truth, fears divine consequences, right? Pentheus is the denier aspect of the lower self. He mocks mystery and fears surrender. Aegisthus is the manipulator aspect of the lower self, avoids confrontation and seeks control through seduction. So these are three, I picked these three myths because these are three aspects of the lower self. You know, the one who wants to repress and hide things, the one who denies things that are right in front of them, that ignorance is bliss mentality, and the one who seeks to control through different manipulative tactics, that comes from the lower self. Those are all actions when you choose to hide the truth, hide from the divine, when you choose to mock and deny the truth right in front of you, and when you choose to manipulate the truth. You are acting from the lower self, and so the lower self does everything and anything possible to avoid the truth coming from themselves, truth of the divine, and the truth of other people. So related to last week's episode, the lower self does anything to deny the truth of free will, to deny the truth of spiritual development, and to deny the truth of the soul. So to overcome that, you must choose to honor. That's why it's a big thing about honoring the authenticity of your soul. So the lower self is not just ego. It is the part of us that resists truth, fears transformation, and clings to control. In Greek myth, it appears not as a villain, but as a mirror. King Minos hides the shadow he refuses to face, and a monster is born. Pentheus mocks the divine feminine and is torn apart by it, and by the mystery he denied. Aegisthus plots in silence and is undone by the very justice he tried to escape. The myths do not punish, they reveal. They show us what happens when we choose fear over truth, control over surrender, and vengeance over healing. The lower self is seductive, but it is never sovereign. It builds labyrinths, but the soul always seeks the thread. So as you reflect on these stories, ask not just what you fear, but what you're hiding, denying, or manipulating to avoid becoming who you truly are. The higher self waits beyond the shadows, and the myths remind us descent is not failure. It is the beginning of transformation. All three of these male figures in mythology could have chosen a different path that could have led to transformation, but they chose to stay the same. The lower self denies change and transformation to stay stuck in stagnancy so it can remain in control. And the key is to let go of that and seek the higher self. So some affirmations to help with that is I face my shadow with honesty and grace. It does not define me. I release the need to control what I fear and choose to understand it instead. I honor the divine within me by choosing truth over manipulation. I do not fear the monster in the labyrinth. I follow the thread of my becoming. Even in descent, I am guided by the light of my higher self. So journal prompts to guide us forth for next week. Firstly, where in my life am I hiding a truth I'm afraid to face, and what would it mean to name it? Second, what part of me seeks control or power out of fear, and how does that affect my choices? Third, when have I denied or mocked something wild, intuitive, or divine feminine within me, and why? Number 4, what labyrinth have I built to avoid confronting my shadow, and what thread might lead me out? And number 5, if I meet my lower self as a mythical figure, what would they say, and what would I say back? See, the key of that last prompt is kind of the whole purpose of this episode, is how can we face the shadow, face the lower self head on, challenge it, overcome its control, understand the lessons that it teaches, and choose the path of enlightenment. So, that being said, that concludes this week's episode. And we're just going to pull from the cup to see what next week will be. So we're going to leave it up to the fates. Let's see. Okay, this is a big one. Art of channeling in myth. So the art of channeling, which is something that I do over on the Realm of Inspiration, how is that showcased in myth? So I'm very excited for episode 10 to be this. I was very excited when I put this in the cup because there are so many examples of channeling in myth. So a completely different aspect, more following divine guidance and embracing the divine and the messages that they have to share. So until next week, let us keep awakening the ancient wisdom within us that have been left before us by the ancient ones. I wish you luck in this week to uncover and face the lower self head on and choose the path of enlightenment.